Hi everybody, I'm Lynette Russell and I'm very pleased to welcome you to the first of our monthly seminars for the Global Encounters and First Nations People, 1,000 Years of Australian History Laureate Program. And I'm incredibly thrilled tonight to have the wonderful Nick Evans talking to us. Before I start, I will acknowledge that we are meeting today on the unceded lands of Naarm, we know it as Melbourne, the unceded lands of the Wurundjeri and Woiwurrung people, and we honour their elders past and present. And we thank them also for their constant support in all the work that we do on their country. It's a thrill tonight to have Nick here. This has been a stop-start event for quite some time now. We've tried to get him here, but finally COVID has not won, and we have. So it's an absolute thrill. He's going to be talking to us today on Macassan words, mirror or compass, sleuthing the history of Macassan words in Northern Australia. And I'm just delighted to hand over to Nick. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lynette, for the kind and tenacious invitation to get me here. Like Lynette, I would like to acknowledge that we're gathering on the unceded lands of the Woiwurrung and Wurundjeri peoples here, and also to pay my respects to their elders, past and present. And also, I guess it's a theme of your project that there was a long period of contact without any session or needing for session, and with a different type of respect to Indigenous sovereignty, to that which followed the British invasion. And knowing that people are on Zoom, I would also like to say selamat sore to any of my Indonesian friends who are there, and possibly goeiemorgen if there's anyone there in the Netherlands. I don't know. Maybe there's people elsewhere as well. So unfortunately, best plans sometimes go astray. I had a PowerPoint with embedded sound files in a number of interesting languages, but because of incompatibilities between Mac and everyone else, that's not going to work. So I'm going to have to fake some sound files. So please forgive the inauthenticity of those when we get to them. Okay, so I love talking to non-linguists. It's a difficult dialogue sometimes because linguists often go off into a rather autistic world of our own, and yet there's buried treasures in there, which it's lovely to talk about. A project like yours, I know, is bringing together people from a number of disciplines, and regard this as an opportunity to continue that dialogue, but I may make some false steps. I might use things which are too obscure, or where I've erred one way or another in what I take to be the common ground we will try and build up during this talk. So please interrupt immediately if things seem to get too obscure. I don't mind at all if that happens, and then of course we'll have discussion as we get to the end. So as you all know, this is probably a redundant slide. The Macassans in Northern Australia, we know that they had contact around the coasts. Exactly how far, is an interesting, still unanswered question. And we know that the primary commercial driver was the gathering of dried sea cucumber, also known as beche de mer or trepang in English, which itself is a loan word from Malay peribang, and then in Macassar is this taribang, and then that shows up in lots of North Australian languages. Just to give two examples, in Iwaja that's tariba, and in Maong that's jaribang. And I saw earlier that Campbell is here in Zoom. Hi, Campbell. It's an honour to have you here in the audience, and I'd like to pay tribute also to Campbell's magnificent book, The Voyage to Marege, which really was such an inspiring investigation into this issue. I first read it just before going to Mornington Island, actually, but when I was at the beginning of my PhD, and it was that book that made me want to learn Indonesian because I was immediately interested in whether there would be Macassan loanwords in Guidelp, which is the language in northwest Queensland that I was working on the time. So that's something that's gone back as an interest a long way for me. And of course, we can talk about North Australia, we can talk about Macassar, so a slightly problematic term that I'll return to in a moment, but that hooks Australia up to a much wider trade network. Again, I must apologise if I'm telling you things that everyone knows constantly, but it's just in case. The real commercial imperative, it seems, for the flowering of the trepang industry when it started was onward shipment to China, where trepang was a very popular and valuable commodity, but almost exclusively transshipped and sold on via Macassar as an entrepot for doing that. So here I show the way that North Australia was hooked up to southern China. That's the view if one traces the trepang itself as the object. But we could also look at things another way. Oh, that's interesting. And trace the words themselves. And if we do that, yeah, that's down here. Yeah, okay. So if we do that, we see a much more far-flung map. And this is where some of the words would have been benefited from having sound files, but we can just say them anyway. So we'll just zero in on some words from Iwaja, which is spoken here, that's very close to Port Essington. It's even possible that the name Iwaja is partially of Macassaris or Bugis origin. So that is that it comes from Riwajak, where Wajak is like the tolling station, and Ri is the locative prefix in a number of languages, or D in Indonesian, of course. And so that might or might not be the case. We're not sure. But Iwaja is a language that I've done some work on. And here is Joy Williams, who was one of my Iwaja speakers, now deceased, and taught me a lot of things about the language. So probably contacts with Yolngu languages in Northeast Arnhem Land are a little bit better known and have rather more loanwords, but still there's a significant number here in Iwaja. So I'm just going to look at 5 of those words there. Rupiah, money, this is in the Iwaja pronunciations. Bandirang, flag. Jaliwara, trousers. Jimuru, east. And Kapala, boat. And then if we follow the trail back in Macassaris, those would respectively be pronounced. Pardon, Lily, my poor pronunciation, or maybe I can just get you to say them, since you will say them better than me. So rupiah?
Yes, it's rupiah.
Rupiah, and then
Bandira.
Bandira. Oh, then I'm sorry, I've got the vowel wrong.
But it's Indonesian language, bendera.
Yes, that's which is,
yeah.
And that's wrong. I'm sorry, that should be bandera with an E. And then Salawara, right? Timoro and Kapala. Kapala, yeah. And then I'm saying Malay because that's what it would have been called at the time. I'll just come back to that point in a little while. But rupiah, where you hear the distinctive Indonesian H on the end, and then bandera, sorry for that typo, and then Timur and Kapal for the ship. But if you keep tracing things, some of those things, Timuru sort of stop in Macassaris and Malay, but other ones you keep following the track back, so that the word in Malay and Macassaris for a ship comes from a Tamil word, kapal. So here we've got, another further link. And then there's a number of possible Indic source words for the rupiah, but let's just say we pick Hindi, rupai there. And then the word jalwara for trousers is of Persian origin, shalwar. You would know it probably from many other Indic languages if you know it. Shalwar kameez or salwar kameez is the classic South Indian trousers and sort of long shirt combination. And then we can go to bandeira in Portuguese. Now we can also get, this is funny, it's not there, I hope that's the right version of the PowerPoint, that there's a word for soap. So the Iwaja word for soap is jabon, and then in Arabic that's sabun, right? Is soap. And we'll see also that this is still a rather Eurasiocentric view of where the contexts go, because when we look at the word for tobacco, which often comes out as something like Tumbago, Dumbaigi, it is on Mornington Island. I can't remember what it is in Yanuit, John.
Tumbago.
What is it?
Tumbago.
Okay, so you notice that there's the MB instead of the B that we're used to from English. And that's a word that came in from Portuguese, probably into Portuguese from Spanish, tobacco, and then into Spanish from the original language of the Caribbean, so of Cuba and so on, Taino, and there it was probably tobacco. Okay, so this is connecting way beyond. So the words, if you like, trace pathways of contact more extensive than the actual objects that were a part of the trade. Although, of course, there were many objects brought by the Macassans which had their origins in Europe, such as jars for certain types of alcohol and other things like that.
Kapal.
Oh, it is working. Okay, well, let's just hear these then. Oh, well, is it just the one?
Teasing you.
I don't know what's going on. Okay, so there's this far-flung web, and let's just be a little more thorough about this now. Just given on the map in the slide before, but let's look at some of these languages with more precise examples. So Dutch, which I hadn't given you an example of yet, giving you one for now, I'll give you another one later on. So the Waja word for a bottle is budjelong, which comes from Macassaries, bottle, which ultimately comes from 17th century Dutch bottle. And then Portuguese, I mentioned this word for tobacco, like if we just take Burrata, language from around Manangarita, they say jambaku, and then that probably comes from the Macassaries form, tambako, which in Malay was tambakau, and then from Portuguese, which got it from Spanish, not too far to travel in that case, and then goes all the way back to the Caribbean, Taino, where it actually, apparently, the original meaning was a roll of tobacco leaves. And then Arabic, I mentioned sabon, so on Groot Island, for example, the word for soap is tipwa, which is a little bit disguised. You don't immediately see sabon as present there, but we'll talk about how words undergo changes in their pronunciation a bit later on. Then Persian, I gave that example already. Tamil, I gave the one example of kapal, but lest you think that's a single example, there's also this word, like in Waja mani is a necklace or beads on a necklace, which in Macassaries is money. Malay money. Just it's written with a K, but that's just the orthography for a glottal stop. And just to introduce a technical term, which you mightn't all know, we write it with like a sort of question mark without the underdot is what we call a glottal stop. It's a sound we do have in English. If you say uh-oh in the middle there, that's the sound you make. You just cut it. It's a very prominent feature of Malay and Macassaries and a number of other languages, and some Australian languages as well, as we will see. And then in Hindi, I gave you the example of the word for rupiah before, but that's a little less convincing because several Indic languages have such a word for money. But then the word for key in Iwaja is kunci, which ultimately comes from Hindi, kunci, which came in probably from Malay in this case, kunci. And let's see if these actually play.
Money.
Yeah, okay, so that's the Tamil pronunciation.
Money, money.
And that is, so over here, that's the Macassanese pronunciation.
Money, money.
Very faint. Money, money. I'll just have to fake that one. Okay. So very extensive set of contexts here. And so that's where the words are coming from. And of course, they're going out into a huge number of languages along the coast of North Australia. This isn't supposed to be exclusive because when you get across into the Kimberley, there's some as well, although not nearly as many. But here, some in Tiwi, not that many. Once you hit the Coburg Peninsula, Gharig, Iwaja, here, well, let's call it here, Mardigal and Ilga, this is a sort of family of language in Manukau here. Inland a bit to Amardak. Inland languages like Gunwingu, Malik, Gargujul. Part of the story, which I won't talk about today, is the words that travel inland. So I'll focus on the coasts because there's more happening there. But it's a very interesting story to see what's going on there as well. And then travelling along Jepana Barada around Managrida there, and then of course the Yulma languages, which are probably the most famous and extensive example. And then Groot Island and Indilyakwa, I gave an example already, and Indilyakwa will pop back into the story at the end of the talk. Nungaboyo, or now preferred to be known as Wuboy, and then Mara Angarai Yanua, which I'm sure you've heard a lot about through John's work, and Karawa down here, and then Ladil, and here's Kaidil, which is the language I mentioned before I did my PhD on. Very little there, and that's despite the fact that Matthew Flinders, when he called in there to repair the investigator, actually reported finding a tree which had been felled with an iron axe and the remnants of what looked like, he thought it was some sort of Indonesian earthenware pot or possibly even Chinese. So it's clear that people, oh, and he also mentioned a tamarind tree growing there, which is one of the classic things. So all of those classic sort of archaeological markers of Macassan presence were there, but there doesn't seem to have been direct linguistic input, although, just to give you another little story that I'm not going to follow up further through this talk, the word for a pipe, a smoking pipe there, in Ladil, it's Larawa, and in Kaidil, it's Rarawa. And I've asked a lot of people in Sulawesi about this word, because it's not one I've located in like Census Macassanese dictionary or things, but I have been told that there's a word, one of you might confirm it, larfa, which refers to some sort of opium pipe. I don't know. It may not be a Macassan word. It might be from somewhere else there, but that somehow got in. I don't know if you have that one.
Larawa.
Yeah. And have you ever tracked down origins for that?
Macassan, they just call it Macassan.
Yeah, so people say it's Macassan.
No, it's not there.
But Macassanese speakers say, no, it's not. Yeah. So it's an interesting thing. It's probably from some other language of Eastern Indonesia, or possibly from Sulawesi, but it's not.
Could be the crew, different crew from different.
I think that's right. Yeah. And, they were quite, very varied crew.
Yeah.
Okay. This is just to give you an idea of the numbers of words. They're all slowly moving upwards as we learn more about it. And I'll show you later on how we can add in a couple of interesting new ones to this, but it's, you know, it's not like a different order of magnitude. So the classic article by Walker and Zorc in the early 80s, they gave a figure of 179 from Macassaries or Malay that they felt were well established. As I'll show, a whole field of etymological research where you try and follow up on word histories. You get these sort of marginal ones where you think, is that really a good candidate or not? So for example, the word that means big in Biningunwok is gimuk, which really sounds like gemuk in Indonesian, right? So you'd think it would be, but it doesn't appear in any of the languages around the coast, and it's actually not a word that would normally be borrowed. So it's likely to be a chance resemblance, which you can't rule out. So that's one of the reasons why we don't always know with things. But this is the number for which first Walker and Zorc, and then later on I wrote an article in 1992 surveying a number of these. We feel that these are pretty solid. You know, one or two people might argue with, but they don't get onto that list unless we feel they've got a strong case for it. And although there's a lot of overlap, it's not always the same words. You get some words which just appear in one and not in another, and that's an interesting part of the story too. So some definitions. I suspect some of you might have been sort of grinding your seats because of my terminology, and it isn't straightforward, right? So I'm going to use the word Makassar, which is the English rendition, and Indonesian Makassar, and Makassar is Makassar, as the modern city from which most voyages originated. When people use that word in Northern Australia, there's a pronunciation which varies from language to language, but the ones that I'm used to, like Iwaja and so on, typically pronounce it as, you know, Mangajara, something like that. And that city used to be have as its capital the kingdom of Goa, and then the tribe or people is probably a better term than tribe, although Sleuth sometimes gets translated as tribe. Really, the Macassaries folk, ethnos, spoke their language and were also known as Macassaries. And I'll use a sort of anglicised based on the first part of the Macassaries spelling, Macassar, and that was the language of that. And this is an incredibly ancient kingdom, certainly dates back to pre-Islamic times, as you would all know. There's an epic poem, the Nagara Kretagama, probably composed about 1365, that mentions it. They converted to Islam at a certain point in their history. They were a very well-organized and powerful and enlightened civilization, you know, for many centuries, and waged a successful war of resistance against the Dutch colonizers for a long time, until the sort of Bugis ganged up with the Dutch to sort of, you know, turn them over. It's one of these reversals of history. Then Malay I'll use for basically the ancestor of modern day Indonesian or Bahasa Indonesia, which at the time was the language spoken throughout the Malay world. It was the lingua franca or common language as far, you know, in the Malay Peninsula, also probably along the coasts as far as Vietnam, the Cham Kingdom and so on, and across into the Philippines and eastward into West Papua. I mean, it was, you know, the language to know if you were anywhere there and wanted to talk to people. And it ranged, like English does now, from a sort of high variety, a court variety, written in Arabic, very refined, written in Arabic script, sorry, very refined, used in courtly histories and epics and all of these things, to what's now known as Bazaar Malay, which would be something like the equivalent of Pidgin English, a simplified thing that you can learn quickly and use with strangers who don't speak your language. And then all sorts of fascinating midpoints in between. So I will lump all of those under the English word Malay, Malaya in Indonesian. And then I'll use this word Macassan as a cover term for the voyages organised from Makassar to North Australia and elsewhere. Of course, they went to other places as well, but I'm not going to talk about that today. And the crews of those ships, they were multi-ethnic, and it's not just that in a given ship, there were people from different ethnic groups and linguistic groups, but some ships were commissioned by people of other ethnic groups, notably the Bugis later on, and with a very interesting system of running things, determining profits, determining responsibilities on the ship, and so on, which I won't go into, but ultimately we need to understand in order to understand the linguistic situation and in order to understand matters like what was traded, who came back, and so on. So the crews of those ships would have spoken Macassarese, Malay, and other languages of the archipelago, certainly Bugis, probably. There's a very interesting group, the Bajau, or sometimes known as Sea Gypsies. There's a widespread view that they preceded the Macassarese in their explorations of the North Australian coasts, and maybe when, before the trepang trade took off, they might have traded in some other things like turtle shell. And then, as I mentioned, some ships were organised by Bugis traders, but there's not a single word, as far as I know, in any North Australian language which is demonstrably Bugis and not some other language. So there are words that could be Bugis, but there's nothing that's a better match between Bugis and the language than it is between Macassarese and the same language, for example. That's actually rather unexpected, because we know that Bugis played a big role there. But Bugis often spoke Macassarese as well anyway. So on to loanwords, which is a misnomer, because if you get a loan from a bank, you've got to pay it back. Whereas if you receive a loan word, you don't ever have to give it back. So they're really gift words, if you like, but this is just the words that we use in linguistics for them. And it's when you have a word passing from one language to the other, and it's very rare that a word ends up exactly the same in the receiving language. They can change their sound or pronunciation. They can change their meaning. They can also change their grammar, although I'm not going to talk about that today, or any one of the. That can make tracing their histories perilous, because the more they change, the more interesting it is. In one way, that's the positive. The negative is the more imaginative a person can be in constructing a preposterous word history or etymology. And this is our tragedy as linguists. I think every different discipline has its own pitfalls, but one of ours is that every person on the street believes they know about language, and they tell you, oh yes, I know this word, it's the same word as something somewhere else in the world, and look, it sounds similar. Well, it might be true, but often it's just an accident. So we have to have systematic methods for weeding out the true signal from the false signal. And one of the things that helps us is that what happens on the sound side is generally pretty systematic. So what we know about language is that every language has its own phoneme inventory. So a phoneme is, if you think of it as a significant sound in a language, that's how we think of it. As an English speaker, you might think of it as a sound you would represent by a letter and feel you needed to represent differently. The classic way we teach this in first year, and I'll ask you to do the same thing now, is if we just take sounds written in English with the letter P, and please put your hand in front of your mouth and say the word pin. You should feel a puff of air, right? Now, just put an S in front of that and say the word spin. Okay, no puff of air. So the first one we call an aspirated P, which we write in linguistics as a P with a little H above it, and the second is an unaspirated P. Now, if we were to transcribe those two words into Hindi using the Devanagari script, there's a different letter for those two. If we were to transcribe them into Korean using the Hangul script, there's also a different letter, because in both of those languages, that makes a difference. Like in Hindi, pal and pal are two different words. Just like for us, pin and bin are two different words. So what the small differences are that make a large difference, that is something that probably many of you weren't aware of that difference until now, which shows it's pretty small, but any one of you knows that to mix up pin and bin or lots of other sound pairs in English is significant. So we dive down into language, we work these out. This is part of the job of a linguist, to determine these phoning inventories. And in Macassanese and Malay, they're pretty similar to one another. So that's a B, D. I'm using the J here close to the English J of jump. It's not the technical version of that, but it's useful. And then the G, and then P, T, and I'm writing the C with the value it has in Indonesian. So ch, and then K. This is our friend, the glottal stop that I told you about it. And then M and N. These two sounds we actually have in English. So this N with a left tail is the sound in canyon, and the N with a right tail is the sound we have in sing. But in English, we can't have this one at the end of a word. So if you learn French and have to learn a word like Bourgogne or something, you've got the N, or most Australian Indigenous languages have this at the end of words. And the Ingma we have at the end of words like sing, but we don't have it at the beginning of words, which why people often have difficulty pronouncing Australian words like, say, ngora for camp, Walbury and Pinjarra and so on, because we're not used to making that sound. But in Malay and Macassanese, they occur. And then an S, sometimes a Z, an H, an L, and a W, Y, and some vowels. I'm not going to say too much about vowels. Now, if we compare that to what happens in North Australian languages, this is a bit of a sort of expanded thing, like pooling the sounds found in a number of different languages, because they don't all have exactly the same sound, but these are often described as long, flat sound systems. That is, you make distinctions at a lot of points of articulation where your tongue touches the roof of your mouth. So you might have, I'll illustrate with the nasals because it's more exotic. Ma, na, 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 nya, na will be 6 different words potentially. And even harder to hear than that, I might have it as the first element of what we call a cluster. So before another sound, so I might have something, a word like kunno, 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 kunno. Could also be like 6 different words. So when you learn an Australian language, or when you grow up speaking an Australian language, you have to pay a lot of attention to the fine positioning of the tip of your tongue, the blade of your tongue, the back of your tongue, at different points in the mouth. Same with what we call stops, like P and T. We get long stops as well in some languages, so that's the difference between like appa and appa, atta and atta, and so on. Laterals are L sounds, and often there's lots and lots of those. Allah, 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 Allah. Even Allah, Allah. Couple of R sounds like ara and ara, and then a W. So you can see that this is different from English, but also different from how Macassanese and Malay works. All right. So what happens when you put 2 sound systems together is that usually people can't pronounce all the sounds of another language. So you hear a word and you fail to reproduce some elements of it. But just think of it. words we have in English that come in from Chinese languages like, ketchup or kangkong or anything like that. Very obviously, we don't retain the tone. Right? Like if you're a Mandarin speaker, well, what happened to the tone there? Because we don't even hear that. But there are other things that go missing in action as well. So this is what we call phonological adaptation. Speakers, in taking the words from another language, they just pronounce it as best they can according to the sound habits or the phoneme system of their own language. So if we think of some of these sounds, there's a bunch of sounds from the Macassaries in Malay, and down here on the table, I'm just saying what happens when those words pass into Yolngamata, into Tiwi, the Barara and Maili, into Jebana, into Yanua, and into Yakwa and Nungaboyo, Mara, and Iwaja. It's a little bit different in each language because the receiving languages don't have quite the same sound structure. So as an example, this glottal stop, the one in like uh-oh, the Yolngal languages have a glottal stop. So then when a word like Macassan, pala, for house, passes into Yolngal, Yolngal keeps the glottal stop, pala. But when it's words with that glottal stop get borrowed into Iwaja, for example, they get lost because Iwaja doesn't have glottal stops. So the word for salt in Macassaries, chetla, when it's borrowed into Iwaja, that comes out as jilla. So the glottal stop's just bracketed out because people didn't hear it. Another thing that happens is that there's no S sound typically in Australian Indigenous languages. Of course, modern ones, have often beefed up the sounds they have, but not traditional. So if we look at this word, rasa, rice in Macassaries, that ends up as biraja in Iwaja because the S is perceived or was perceived by speakers as being most similar to a j. So you just substitute the j for the S. And another thing that happens, as this is another aspect of phonological adaptation, is what we call phonotactics in linguistics. So that's the order in which you can put sounds together. How do you build words up? So I mentioned that in English we've got NG sound, like in sung, and we've got an NY sound, if you like in canyon. We've also got that in new. And that NG sound has to be at the end of syllables, the NY sound has to be at the beginning. In a typical Australian language, either one can be at either end. So another thing that happens in English, we're very happy to have words starting with vowels, so at, on, Indonesia, etc. The pronounceable thing. Eng can be at the ends of the words, but not the beginnings. Now let's look at what happens when you get to an Australian language. Lots of Australian languages did not allow words to begin with a vowel. So they hear a word coming in, and that was allowed in Macassaries and Malay, but when those words get heard by speakers of Australian language, they put on a sound at the beginning, which ironically for an English speaker is the hardest sound to pronounce for an English speaker. That is the nga sound. So the Macassari is the word anisi, which it was just like grog, strong drink. It ultimately comes from an aniseed-based beverage from Dutch aniseed or aniseed liquor. That goes into some Australian languages that allow initial vowels. So Amarak and Maragu, for example, comes out as aniji. So look what's happened. S goes to j, standard thing. Glottal stop at the end, drops away, standard thing. Begins with a vowel, no worries, aniji. But then other languages that say words have to start with a consonant, like Barara, they've got nganati, Jepana, nganiti, Yungu, nganiti. All of those ones put on this nga sound at the beginning so that it satisfied the sort of structural requirements for a word. So each language we study like this, we compare the sound systems, and then we can predict what happens. And of course, I've just shown you here for what happens when words pass from one language A to another language B. But often a word might pass through 5 or 6 languages. Each one of those is another little tweak. So often we can infer the whole history of a word, which language it's passed through, by a series of these accumulated phonological tweaks. Then the last little wrinkle is that sometimes loanwords get what we call hypercorrected. So this goes back the other way. Speakers who are at least partially bilingual, they develop a stereotype about what the other language is like. You see this if you read Charles Dickens's portrayals of Cockney English, where people might say, I'll get some hoats for the horse or something like that. That is that Cockney speakers weren't very aware of when words should begin with H's or not. So sometimes they'd leave them off when they were there, and sometimes they'd put them on when they weren't there. That sort of thing happens a lot. And you can see it either with sounds, but also other parts of words. So if you look at what happens to English words borrowed in French, for example, there are words in French that have an ing, which at least some French speakers believe is a real English word, and it isn't. So the footing for jogging based on foot, because then there are other, or even for shampoo, well, you pronounce it. I mean, I might not do justice to the
Shampoing.
Yeah, the shampoing, right, which is spelt as shampooing, right, which we would never say in English. Oh, you know, I went to buy some shampooing, but it's just part of this same belief that, you know, it becomes a marker of Englishness. And interestingly, that very same sound, ing, at the end of words, gets added on to some Macassaries and Malay words as they enter Australian languages. So, word for tamarind, one of the sort of real giveaway archaeological markers of Macassan contact, which is jamba in Macassaries, but in a lot of North Australian languages, it's jamban. People have just sort of added on this ing, or this one, Macassaries kapasa, which is a cotton plant. That comes out in Waja as kapajan. So notice that first of all, that bottle stop got dropped off because it wasn't pronounceable, and then this ing got added on. And even up there, it's become such a stereotype that it's not just the stereotype of Macassanness, but more generally of foreignness. So some English words that have come into these languages also added on. So that cattle are bulikan in Maon, for example. So the ing on the end probably came in as buliki, and then the ung got added on. So this makes the process of tracing what happens with sounds rather intricate, but it's not unprincipled. There's a number of interesting tests and arguments we can apply to sort of trace what's going on. And one of the things we can do with it is to determine in a given instance, how do we know if this is a word that came from Macassaries or Malay? Because often the words are rather similar. And Macassaries has a very unusual feature. So if you look at how words can end in Macassaries, it's very limited. There's not many possibilities. In English, we've basically every vowel, every consonant can end a word. We can have what we call clusters. So if you have a word like links, you know, you've got nks at the end of the word. So there's like hundreds of possible word endings. But in Macassaries, either you end in vowel, or you end in eng, as in song, or you end in their friend, new friend, for some of us, the glottal stop. Okay, so mate, dead, karong, to sack, and kaluru, to roll up a cigar, exemplify ending in vowel, ending in eng, ending in glottal stop. So now, if a word gets into Macassaries from another language with a different consonant at the end, let's just say an R. So lots of words came into Macassaries from Malay or others. So this is just one example. The word for to buy, bayar, which I think it's a coincidence that it sounds a bit like English, bayar. But in Macassaries, that's bayara. Can't end in an ah, so you add this full stop. So what you find is that, and well, this is just another feature of Macassaries that a lot of words end in the ing, partly because that's only one of the three possibilities, but partly because you've got suffixes in Macassaries that form new words that boost the number of words with an ing. So if there's a suffix, you can add ing or an, which takes a noun and derives a new noun meaning place or instrument for dealing with that object. So bandera is flag, banderan is a place where the flag waves or a flagpole. So that means that there were a lot of words in Macassan ending in ing. So now if we look at some words here, I could even give you a little test, say which one will this come from. Let's see if the sound. Oh yeah, okay, wait on. Okay, so that's Iwaja pronounced as very faint. So it's Kabbalah. Sometimes it will be pronounced Kapala because the P and the B aren't distinguished. And then in Tamil. Oh no, that's Bandiran, sorry, Iwaja.
Kapal.
Kapal. Is it Tamil?
Kapal.
Kapal. Is Indonesian?
Kapala.
Kapala. Macassaries, right? So now you look back to the Iwaja and say, Kapala, is that coming from Macassan or Malay? What do people think? You didn't think you were going to be tested.
Macassan.
Yes, how do you know? It ends in the vowel, right? Now, it would be even nicer, of course, if it ended in a glottal stop. And if it was appearing in Yolngu, it would, because Yolngu have the glottal stops. But here they don't, so that at least keep the vowel. And if it came from Malay, it would just be like probably close to the Indonesian pronunciation. And then bandiran, well, if you take that bandera in Portuguese, the ultimate origin, Malay, bandera, although both are written with an E in Malay, of course, the first is what we call a schwa, and the second is an e. But then in Macassaries, bandera, and there's a flag, and bandiran with a flagpole with the eng on it already. That makes it a giveaway with Iwaja, probably that came in from Macassaries. So that you find this interesting thing that in any language of North Australia with a decent number of Macassan loanwords, that is coming from there, you get a mix of words that have come in from Malay and have come in from Macassaries. And of course, it's easier if there's a word which is only found in the dictionary of the one rather than the other. But there's lots of words that are like this, pretty similar between the two languages, but you can pin down which one it comes from.
Bandera.
Bandera.
Okay. So that in itself is an interesting and problematic thing, right? Because you could say, well, okay, that shows that there were two waves of contact. Maybe there was a Macassaries wave or a Malay things, or there were Macassan praus and Malay praus. But another possibility is that crews were just really multilingual. People on those praus were speaking both Malay and Macassaries, and that this is what happened. What we haven't done yet really is to go through and systematically see if it's always the same words that are coming from Macassaries or that are coming from Malay. Because if it's just the two languages being mixed up on the praus, you'd expect a more disorganized pattern to the loanwords. That's research work still to be done. Now, words don't only just change in their sound, they also change in their meaning as they're borrowed. Often this is because when you learn a foreign language or have contact with a foreign language, you don't get the full range of contexts, or else you just do something else with the word. So if you take the word Macassaries, buburu is rice porridge mixed with water or coconut milk. The Waja word buburu, which comes from this, is any sort of porridge or gravy. People sometimes use the English word porridge, but some sort of mixture of flour and water, for example, would be called buburu, which I don't think would be what the Macassans were eating on their grass. And then this one, galuma, which in Macassar is a deck with loose planks, and in Malay, galuma is a deck, but in Waja, kalumang is just a plank or a flat ball surface. Macassar is lesa, which is to bathe and look for shellfish on the beach at low tide, something you can definitely imagine that Macassan sailors doing. And in Maung, rija rija just simply means the lowest ebb of the tide. So that particular activity is no longer there, but you can see why that change occurs. And then this one linking, of course, to the title of my talk, that Patumang in Macasarese and Paduman in Malay. In Iwaja, there's the word Padumang, but while it means like compass in Macasarese and Malay, in Iwaja it just means mirror. Now, presumably one of the things that happened when Macassan crews headed off after a season of working with Japan was they wanted to make gifts and just passed on stuff, and like many a gift giver, they had some stuff that they didn't really want anymore, like sort of leftover things or things that weren't in perfect condition. Probably there were things like broken compasses that were passed on, or else they really did give compasses, but they, didn't last all that long, and then the reflective surfaces from the compasses got used as mirrors. So whatever the exact story of Patumang is, it's there as an example of semantic change. This is just something I don't want to go into in all the detail that this slide suggests, but it's to tell you that what we call semantic domains or semantic fields, so we can group words into meaning classes, like words to do with boating, words to do with building and carpentry, words to do with clothing, material and adornment, and infer from the meaning types of the loanwords coming in what the nature of contact was. So for example, if you look at German loanwords coming into English around the 1930s, 1940s, there was lots of words like, Blitzkrieg, so on, and Reich, which had to do with, German military expansion, Nazi military expansion at that time. Here, for very obvious reasons, boating, building and carpentry, clothing. But there were other things as well, commerce and trade, some fauna. That's very interesting because that might suggest additional things which were prized by Macassans, possibly for trade or possibly for other use, like they had to eat and stuff while they were there. So maybe getting crabs, for example, or something. Fire and artificial light, fishing, lots of introduced plants. Some of that's covered up, but coconut, tamarind, and a few other things. Food and preparation, meals, social roles. So you probably all know that in Australian languages, there's not traditionally a word that means friend because everyone's kin. And a friend is usually someone who's outside your kin. But in Arnhem Land, there's a word, for example, in Piringunwak, it's Jawina, which means friend, which ultimately comes from Kawana, which is like your sort of senior person or something in Macassan. And then the idea of having a boss is a bit alien in traditional terms outside ritual contexts. And then that often comes in as some variety of bunkawa and so on that's come in because it's very clear who was the boss on the Macassan boat. Smoking, obviously, tools, weapons and artifacts, winds and directions, and writing. So I'm not going to go into the details of all that, but you can read in some of the linguistic articles about this if you're interested in pursuing those further. So I want to talk now about something that we can call linguistic stratigraphy. And Pat McConville has been someone who's done a lot of the sort of foundational work here. And the idea is that you can use these loanwords to calibrate history. And the idea of stratigraphy, of course, is something that's known from a lot of fields, whether you study palimpsests or maybe you study rock art and look at rock art styles. So we've got sort of famous X-ray styles overlaid on top of another style in Arnhem Rock Shelter. And by looking at which stylistic type gets superposed on which other type, you can infer their relative temporal stratification. So it's the same with languages. So sounds change over time. We know this is happening. So famously in Melbourne, as we speak, this is the world capital and the Australian capital of an ongoing, we could say, neutralization between the sounds L and L. This is happening. It's also a historical event of a sort of strange type. But it wasn't happening 100 years ago, and it probably will have finished happening 100 years hence. So it's a sort of slow unfolding historical event, maybe in some households, not others. It hasn't spread out from Melbourne to other Australian capital cities yet. So what we can do when we look at these sounds, this is a much deeper time one, English P became F. So if we take an English word like father, compare it with Latin, pater, and lots of others, Latin keeps the original sound there. And you can show that because if you go across all the way to Sanskrit, it's like pitar and so on. And we have heart, Latin has cordis. The resemblance between those words may or may not be obvious to you, but if I tell you that there's lots and lots of words where English has H and Latin has cur, again, this is part of what was known as Grimm's Law. So one of the brothers Grimm, Jacob Grimm, sort of discovered this, and it was a really important moment in historical linguistics. So we can look at these changes, which, as I said, are historical events. Sometimes historical events lasting centuries, but still they can be located in time. And here's another one example from English. So here we've got time at the bottom. So this is the archaeologist's pit way of showing time. Older is lower. So if we just take that very word, time, spelt T-I-M-E, English orthography or writing system famously awful, like why write an E on the end of the word that's not pronounced? Well, because in 1400, that word was pronounced time. And then by 1500, it was like time. And by about 1650, it was like time. And then it became something like time, like that it is now, and eventually that E dropped away. And we can also see like C, which is S-E-E. And if you come into English from Indonesian or Spanish or whatever, English is the only language that writes E as a double E. And around 1400, that was C. And then it became C, and then in my English is like C or something. It's a diphthong. And other interesting things like the EE and the EA, which are pronounced the same. So if I say meat, spell meat, some of you might spell it M-E-E-T and some might spell M-E-A-T. Well, in Old English, this was air, this was air. So one was meat, one was met or something. We know that among other reasons because Shakespeare used different rhyming schemes for the two. So there's ways we can know these things. And then through time. Now, the reason I'm telling you about I, the sound I, is if you have to pronounce English was written with I, you don't always know how to pronounce it. So I can say there's I as in pizza, which is the original sound, or as in policeman, right? Or as in I, rhyming with I. How come? Well, it's because that change happened at a particular time. So here, right? And some words came into English just in time to catch the change. So they were there for the big show. Word agile, for example, jumped onto the tram in time and is now pronounced agile, whereas the word police came in too late to have itself turned around, which is why we pronounce it as police and not police, whereas lice is lice. So by looking at things like this in English, we can see this, and most importantly, we can locate words coming into the language and determine from their pronunciation when they arrived. So this is a sort of first sort of part of the technique of linguistic stratigraphy. Now, of course, in different languages, the sounds that change and when they change are different. Here's something in the Iwajan languages, so it's like Iwaja, Ildar, Margul, Maon around Port Essington. They had a series of changes that took long stops, like a word like kapal for boat, turned them into short stops like kapal. They got rid of their long stops, or long T's like kata, just kata. And then the short stops got weakened. So the old P becomes a W, the old P becomes a R, the old T becomes a R, the old Ch becomes a Y, the old K becomes a R. And then the things that used to be here, like the old W, becomes nothing, and the old Y becomes nothing. So it's like a sort of push where people are getting pushed off the seats, a bit like sort of musical chairs. So we've been able to show that by comparing words in that family with words in other families and so on. And just to illustrate with an example, the word for a plover, the bird, which is beret, we would reconstruct that with a long P here and then a short P here. In modern, you want to have like weret. So the first P became a W, the long P became a short P. Or the word for a folding fishing net, which is wallaby in Gunwap, for example, is just alawi. In Elijah, so the W, which was here, dropped off, and the P, which was here, changed to a W. All right, so we can do all of this detective work and work out what changes occurred. Okay.
We've just gone up to 7.
Okay.
So,
I'm about 4 slides away from
okay,
finishing.
so
Is that right?
A couple of people are dropping off.
Oh, yeah. Sorry. Yeah. Okay.
Thank
I'll
you.
step on the pedal, right? Maybe what I'll do is I'll leave the linguistic stratigraphy stuff, interesting as it is, just to pass on to. Okay. The final couple of points. So the final things. First of all, been talking about loanwords from Macassan and Malay, but an interesting, still unresolved question is whether the linguistic evidence points to there being earlier contexts. But there's a few words which have come in from, they look like they've come in from something like Macassaries or Malay or possibly another language, which have caught that sound change. So the most Macassan words that came in, most Malay words that came in, missed out on the great consonant shift, just like police missed out on becoming polite when it came into English. But this one has undergone it. So the Iwaja word for tooth is yiri, which also gets used for a fish hook. So that's made it in time, right? Well, is that an older word? Could be. Word for work, which in Iwaja, yaman, it's yaman, they work. Well, that comes from a word jama, which is to work on the decks and so on. So here, the fact that the j is becoming a y also shows that it caught the wave. It was there in time. And there's a couple of others like that. So could those words have arrived earlier in the initial stages of contact? If so, what does it tell us? It might be that a shift was just starting to happen. It might be that some words were borrowed at an earlier phase when there were just a few words being borrowed. Other words were borrowed later. We don't fully understand the reason, but I'm just giving it to you as one of our puzzles. And then just to sort of do the last little case study, this was a good thing that happened through COVID. An email came to Campbell McKnight and to myself by someone who I'll put up the source in a second, to point out that he's like a marine biologist interested in the depletion of certain marine resources, especially sharks, sawfish, wedge fish, and things like this. And here we've got one of these beautiful wedge fishes, and pointed out, okay, Yolngo lundara wedge fish looks like similar to wedge fish in Bougainese, which is lontara. Macassar is lontara, which is basking shark. I mean, these are just essentially different names for related species. In Maong, lundaran is a giant shovel-nosed ray, and the Macassar's Nederlandse Woordenboek of Sense lists the third meaning of the word lontara as, in Dutch it's called a rozenhaai. It's a type of basking shark. And then he also gives us the Linnaean name. And if we think about it, that in Macassar is the third meaning he gives. And I'll take this word lontara. It's my slide on that. Did it get out of order? Yeah, okay. So I'll just jump forward and then back. So you will probably all know, I imagine, that the traditional writing system for Macassars and Bugis is this amazing writing system known as lontara, which looks like this or looks like that. This is how you write Basa Ugi, Bougainese language, in the lontara script. So each one of these represents a consonant with what we call an inherent vowel. So this is actually ba and this is sa, whereas the u and the yi, you've got a sort of u part and then you put some little dots around it to turn the vowel from an r into an u or an e. So this is how it looks when it's written out. And this script was inscribed on the leaves of the lontar palm, which is lontar in Indonesian or Malay and lontara in Macassaries. And then the writing system itself is known by the same word, lontara. And traditionally it was written onto these long spools, which you read by spooling and sort of chanting or reading them out. So, and that's why you have this angular form. Ultimately, it's an Indic script. Ultimately, it's related to scripts in the Middle East, deep time. But scripts get adapted to the media that they're written. So this word now, lontara, has these three meanings of the lontar palm, the lontar writing system, the lontara writing system, and these wedge fish. Well, why? If you look at them, you see these beautiful markings. I don't know whether that's actually called fins or what they call, I think they are, down there, which look like lontara. And that's why that word has that third meaning in Macassan. And as well as that word, well, if we just say, why would that word be borrowed? Like, why would languages borrow a fish name? When I listed those semantic domains, there were a couple of things like, coconuts and tamarinds coming from Indonesia, a couple of local things maybe coming back. But, there's words for those fish all over the coasts of Australia. It's not something that you didn't know about until the Macassans arrived. So, and it's not like other things that only came in with the Macassans, like cauldrons or iron or whatever, which each brought in their own word. The one explanation is that the Macassans weren't only interested in Japan, but also in shark fins, which would have been equally appreciated on the same Chinese market. Like Japan, they were supposed to be an aphrodisiac, and one of which they commanded a high price that old men failing in their virility were willing to pay large sums for things that would pep them up. So you had these things possibly being traded, and there's an article here that I stumbled across by Jenny Joserdale on the phenotypic and genetic diversity in the wedgefish. And this is a threatened ray of high value because they are still being poached for their fins. And as well as that, so Matthew McDavitt, who's the one who initiated this conversation, he's turned up another one, which is word for shark in an Indiyakwa, for example, a couple of other languages, which is mangiwanga or mangiwanga, and in Macassanese, that's like mangiwang. So it's another word that's coming. Now, again, Australian languages traditionally had sharks, but if this was an important trade item, like I've checked in a few places what's the traditional term for trepang in areas outside Macassan, and there were words for trepang. So in Kaido, it's tupun, for example, which is not a Macassan word. There's like Kaido word for shark is one pool. So it's not that there weren't traditional words for shark. Why did the word for shark get borrowed? Possibly if it was a prized commercial item that could be there. So this is something else. I don't know whether your group's been looking at shark fin trade, right? So thanks to Matthew McDavitt for raising these. It's another illustration of how the list of words is still growing. Okay, so just to conclude with the 4 points of the compass, first point is that we've only been able in this talk to touch on a fraction of what Macassan loanwords can tell us. We've got a sort of saying in these linguistics that each word has its own history. Each word does. I hope I've shown that to you. And if we just compare salt, I already mentioned to you the borrowing of the Macassan word chetla into gila as salt, because people didn't traditionally have salt as an item. But just yesterday, I was asked by a colleague, what about sugar? Other words from sugar coming into North Australian languages? As far as I know, there aren't, but might show up. Hasn't been reported. So that's something else out there. And new loanwords keep turning up. These wedgefish and shark words are some. Then that throws the ball back into the historian's court. So I'll be very interested as the historians among you start going back to looking at bills of lading, commercial transactions from those sales made in Macassar onwards to Chinese merchants to see if there are reports of shark fins. And it might have been that only the captains were allowed to bring those, because we know that the captains of the prows could have their own little sort of extra stuff that they brought.
Kelly Clayton's just mentioned in the chat that in Knapp and Sutherland's 2004 piece, they note that shark fin was of interest in Macassar from the 17th century onwards. Okay. But they don't say where the shark fin came from.
Yeah.
This is a beautiful and tantalising clue.
Yeah. Okay, that's really interesting, and possibly one that preceded, although the distribution of these shark and wedgefish words, well, it might turn out to be more broad. I mean, than we had previously thought. And then the third point is that just like artifacts, in a broader sense of artifacts that includes like tamarind trees, for example, and like genes, loanwords help us fasten together the histories of Indigenous Australia and histories of the rest of the world beyond the seas. And ironically, this can lead us back to an understanding of dynamic processes of change inside Australia itself. I skated over this bit where I was talking about, I would have talked about the role of loanwords in helping us calibrate the diffusion of the system of subsections or skins out to the north coast. We know that was I think we could say invented or devised around the Victoria River at some time by putting together two four-class systems. Patrick McConville did some magnificent detective work on that back in 1985 and has been pursuing that ever since as we sort of look at the outward diffusion. At some point they reached the north coast. Question is when, and then can we make inferences back? So it's just an example of how these stories aren't just stories about outside contact, but how they can tell us more about the history and dynamism of social elaboration in Indigenous Australia. And a final point, which somehow went missing, is that I can't remember. But it doesn't matter because I'm over time and it might
that's
come.
all
So
right.
I'll stop there. Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Which is, this was a talk about Macassan loans, but if we go back further in time, there's possibly other stories like other seafarers from Eastern Indonesia, hinted at that at a certain point. The contacts that gave rise to the dingo, that carried that kangaroo ticks to Thailand, possibly other things as well. Water rats, maybe, I don't know. What's happened there with words for there, and possibly even further back in time, contacts with other maritime parts of the world. I think contacts with southern India and Dravidian languages there may end up showing us interesting things. We haven't got that far with it.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I'm just going to let everyone who's on the Zoom know that the rest of us have the opportunity to continue this conversation with Nick. So if anybody has a burning question or a comment on the Zoom, no, I'm just getting lots of gratitude and many thanks for terrific and wishing us a good weekend. I can't see any questions at this stage. I think it's just probably, if anyone in the room has a burning question that they would like to ask now, or we can continue this over dinner, which might be very nice. So, okay, well, I think that might be to say goodbye. Thank you, everybody online, and thank you so much, Nick, for that. Was
thank
just
you again for the
magnificent.
invitation.
My brain is going in 20 different directions because there's so much in there, very rich. Thank you.